Welcome to today's video conference. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Monday night, December 21st, Congress approved a $900 billion relief package designed to rescue millions of Americans facing the end of unemployment benefits and eviction moratoriums. Today, our briefing focuses on the prospects for economic recovery in 2021 and what the relief package will or will not accomplish. So now let me turn the conference over to our moderator, Sunita Sarabji.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We start off with Congressman Ted Lou. He is also a member of the House Progressive Caucus, which actively pushed for a second relief check to be included in the stimulus bill, amongst other provisions. Congressman Lou, I turn the call over to you.
Thank you, Sunita. So in terms of the COVID relief package, it is smaller than I would have preferred. The House version was passed on May 15th, the $3.4 trillion HEROES Act. We then passed a second version after Mitch McConnell blocked the first one of $2.2 trillion. Again, Mitch McConnell, the White House blocked that. So we finally had to settle for this relief package of a little over $900 billion. So I think it's far too small. At the same time, it's better than nothing. And that's why I voted for it. It is, just as a factual matter, bigger than the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act under Obama, the stimulus package that was passed then. So it's not an insignificant bill. I just don't think it is big enough to address the scale of this pandemic. But there are some really good provisions in it. For example, there is $81.88 billion going to education, of which $54.3 billion will go to K through 12 education. That is 4 times more than the $13.5 billion in their CARES Act. This legislation also has $25 billion going to rental assistance and extends a moratorium on evictions for another month. It has $284 billion going to forgivable paycheck protection loans for small businesses. It's got $7 billion for broadband. It's got billions of dollars to ensure vaccine distribution and delivery. So there's a lot of very good provisions in this bill. I think the stimulus checks are far too small at only $600. At the same time, a family of 4 will get $2,400. So it's not insignificant. It's just not enough, in my opinion. And that's why I look forward to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris coming in. Happy to answer any questions anyone may have. And thanks again for being on this call.
Absolutely. And undocumented immigrants are once again left out of this relief bill. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and the rationale for that.
Well, there's no good rationale for that other than that Republicans objected. However, mixed status families are included in this relief bill.
And that is different from the previous relief bill?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Could you just explain that a little bit more for our...
Oh, sure. So in the first relief bill, if your spouse was undocumented, there'd be no relief. This one fixes that, that sort of glaring bad provision. And so while we don't capture an entire family of undocumented, but if there's a mixed status family, we do capture that.
Absolutely. And the $81 billion that you mentioned going to education, is that going to fix some of the issues with broadband, which have left low-income children unable to access a significant education?
It's a little closer to $82 billion. That's a different pot of funding or different pots of funding than the additional $7 billion on top of that directly for broadband access. So it's actually in addition to the education funding, the $7 billion for broadband.
What are you hoping from the Biden administration? Will there be a third stimulus bill?
I'm very confident there will be a third stimulus bill. So we'll see what happens.
Absolutely. Let's go to the chat and get questions from reporters. Pilar Marrero has a question for you.
Hi, Congressman. So many critics have pointed out that the first loans, or the PPP, the loans for businesses, was riddled with problems and difficulties, and also corruption, and many money going to big businesses that people are critical of. Do we have any assurance that this time around, small businesses and the businesses that really need it will get the money?
So you're correct. There were a number of instances of businesses getting paycheck protection loans that should not have. At the same time, the overwhelming majority of small businesses got the loans, but there were absolute abuses. And that's why the House of Representatives set up an entire oversight committee to look at how their stimulus funding is being spent. That work will continue. And the Small Business Administration has repeatedly said they're trying to fix those issues. We also made sure that smaller banks, community development banks, and others, and minority institutions also were able to access this money to then give to the small businesses who are their customers. So it should be a better second version this time around, but we need to have continued congressional oversight, and that's just an ongoing problem.
So just to follow up on that question, has the scope of the PPP program been limited to smaller businesses?
Well, it's always been like that. It's just that some companies were able to abuse the system, and some of it has to do with how they sort of counted what qualified for the company. But I think because of all the press on it, that the Small Business Administration has really ratcheted up sort of their enforcement of this, and it should be a much better second version, partly because of what that press has highlighted and what the Congressional Oversight Committees have done.
We have a question from Henrietta Burrows. Henrietta?
Thanks so much, Sunita. Congressman Lou, could you tell us why Mitch McConnell was blocking previous bills, since he was hurting his own constituency? And it seems to me if the Republicans had participated in passing the bills, they could have taken credit for it, especially before the election. So what was in McConnell's interest?
That is a great question, and is one of the great mysteries this year. I remember when Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin were actually working on a $1.8 billion compromise, and Mitch McConnell very publicly came in and said, do not do that. And he basically shut that down by conveying to the White House that was not going to pass the US Senate. This was before the election. I have no idea why he did that. And I don't know why Donald Trump didn't push harder prior to the election, because I do think, just as a matter of politics, it would have helped Trump to have a whole bunch of stimulus checks going out with his name on it prior to the election. So my only conclusion is maybe Mitch McConnell just wasn't so excited about helping out Trump prior to the election.
We have a question from Julia Dudley about evictions. Julia.
Yes, thank you, Congressman Lowe. Thank you for your presence in helping us to get to this whole mess and mirage of COVID-19. What we are concerned about is the tsunami of evictions that's already happening in California. And we are finding that you do have some bad players of landlords who are either afraid to report their income so they don't take in the different programs, federal programs that could help renters. What are some ways to help that this will help these landlords be able to fall in line and to make sure renters are not out on the streets? The people we've interviewed, for instance, just in the past few days, have been evicted during this moratorium. So those are some sincere concerns that we do have. Thank you. So
when landlords violate the law, that's an enforcement issue, and that's going to be up to the local city or county to address that. So hopefully we have better enforcement, and for egregious violations, they can get prosecuted. The $25 billion rental assistance, it is a bit complicated. It basically works in a variety of ways. One is it will pay the landlord directly. That's one way to do it. Another is it will pay the tenant, who then pays the landlord. And it's a lot of sort of different provisions sort of explain in each sort of circumstance, how does this money flow, and does it flow to the tenant or to the landlord? But the point of it is to make sure that the tenant can stay and not get evicted.
Sandy Close has a question for you.
I have about a dozen questions.
Yes.
The one, in the interest of time, how will the relief bill help small farmers and rural communities in particular? Can you help us understand that? And that includes California, rural communities in the Central Valley and Northern California.
So there are two, so as you know, Congress did two things. We passed the COVID relief package, and then we passed an annual spending bill. So in the annual spending bill, there's assistance to farmers and people who are in rural areas, including, for example, there's this program called the Farm to Food Bank program, or Farm to Family program, depending on what state it is that uses it. Essentially, it pays farmer money so they don't destroy their crops, and then they give their crops to food banks, and it pays for distribution of, for example, Central Valley farmers to send their crops down to food banks in my district in Southern California. So there's sort of a variety of different programs out there that do help farmers, and the broadband also does try to get broadband everywhere, including not just inner city areas, but also rural areas as well. And then farmers who fit within the PPP guidelines can apply for paycheck protection loans as well. There's also additional funding for the economic injury disaster loan, which has a different set of criteria that a lot of businesses can actually participate in if they don't participate in the PPP program.
Thank you so much for joining us on the call today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for all that you do.
Thank you. We move next to Chad Stone, who is the Chief Economist at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. So the people who are bearing the brunt of the high unemployment in the COVID crisis are people who work in jobs requiring face-to-face contact, the majority of which pay low wages. And a disproportionate number of them are people of color who are underserved seriously by the outdated unemployment insurance system before the crisis, when the share of unemployed workers receiving UI was at historic lows due to cutbacks in the maximum number of weeks of regular UI available in some states and a failure to modernize UI eligibility criteria for the 21st century economy. UI still thinks that the average unemployed worker, the structure of UI still thinks that the average unemployed worker is a white male breadwinner on temporary layoff from a job he's going to go back to. And that's not the job market that we have now and haven't had for quite a while. We need UI reform. But anyway, what we did get in the CARES Act originally is that the people that I was just talking about who were underserved by the outdated UI system benefited from the strong measures in the CARES Act, which added weeks of benefits beyond the normal 26 weeks that are available or less in some states, increased the weekly benefit amount by the famous $600 a week that was in until July 31st, and also expanded eligibility to people who fell through the cracks of the existing UI system. Those are really important developments, and kind of thinking about why we're going to need more down the road, it's worth looking at what those UI measures in the CARES Act, which have been extended in the new legislation, and what the stimulus payments did accomplish. So during the worst of the economic downward spiral, they provided substantial relief for jobless workers that sustained them and sustained the economy to the degree that the recession was not even worse and the hardship was not even worse than it was. The economy plunged, unemployment soared. Bad as it was, it could have been worse. The cruel irony is that as the economy was starting to come out of the deep hole it was in, the $600 disappeared at the end of July. And there was no further stimulus to keep the recovery going, and the economy slowed. Unemployment remained high, the jobs hole remained huge, and UI benefits were pitifully small without that $600 for those who needed them most. So with almost 10 million fewer jobs than we had in February, and the pace of job creation slowing month after month, it was looking like we were making the same mistake that we made in the Great Recession. And we stopped providing stimulus and hardship relief prematurely. Furthermore, people of color were experiencing what they always experience over the business cycle, suffering disproportionate unemployment and underemployment in the recession, and seeing improvements much more slowly once the economy started to turn around. So at the beginning, all unemployment rates were at historic lows for whites, blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans. And then by April, white and black rates had jumped 11 points, the Latino rate had jumped 12 points, and the Asian American unemployment rate had jumped 14.5 points to 18.9%. In April, that was the group with the highest unemployment. In November, the jobs report I just reported on, the white rate was still almost 3 points higher than it was in February, but the Black and Latino and Asian rates were 4 to 4.5 points higher than in February. And those are recession levels. So I think one reason opponents of this round of stimulus that just got passed, one thing that they argued was, well, the economy is doing great. Why do we need additional stimulus? And the fact is that the economy was slowing down and we were only halfway back. Furthermore, the unemployment rate doesn't capture the full extent of unemployment and underemployment, because in a recession, people drop out of the labor force or can't get as many hours as they would like. The share of the population with a job, the so-called employment to population ratio, was lower for Black and Hispanic workers than for white workers at the start of the recession, and it's fallen more for them since. So beyond unemployment, people who've dropped out or not getting enough work, as much work as they want, is still way too high. So the latest legislation is a bit of a reprieve. The CARES Act had, I'm not sure what the name of the new legislation is, but it extended the additional weeks of unemployment insurance in the CARES Act. It added weeks. It expanded, extended the CARES Act's expanded eligibility criteria in the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, the PUA, and it reinstated a federal supplement. This time it was only $300, not $600. But these were only extended into March of next year. So I'll say that there are two things that are good about the reprieve. One is that, yes, in the CARES Act, it was cold turkey when the act was going to expire, so that no matter how many weeks of federal extended benefits you were receiving or PUA you were receiving, it just stopped. The new legislation has a phase out so that no one new can come into those programs after March 15th. March 14th, March 15th. But if you still have some weeks of federal benefits that you haven't yet used, you have until April 5th. So that's a smoother phase out. Nevertheless, we saw the good that the CARES Act measures did in providing stimulus to the economy and in relieving hardship. And in unemployment insurance, they were good. And it's good that they've been extended. But the economy is not going to be back anywhere near where it needs to be when we have to do it again. And we should be working from walking into office. The new Congress and President Biden and Vice President Harris should be working, among all the other things they're doing, to make sure that we have the stimulus that we need to relieve the hardship that's still out there and that will be needed to generate a robust, sustainable, and equitable recovery going forward. So I will pause there, and I'm happy to take questions.
So I'll start it off with a couple of questions. You spoke about the racial disparities. Blacks, Latinos, Asians, as you mentioned, were doing well before the start of the pandemic. But during the pandemic, their unemployment rates have gone much higher than, and I wonder if you could explain some of the racial disparities that surround unemployment.
Well, so you described the numbers. We have the legacy of racism. We have ongoing discrimination. Certainly for the workers that we're talking about, have experienced discrimination. There's still disparities in hiring and in employment. You mentioned that, as I said, that the unemployment rates were at historic lows for Black or African American and Hispanic or Latino workers, but the Black unemployment rate was still twice the white unemployment rate as it has been historically. What I say about the Black unemployment rate is that if you look at the long time series of data over business cycles, the Black unemployment rate in the best of times is barely better than the white unemployment rate in the worst of times. And what we needed to get to those good outcomes at the end of 2019 and at the very beginning of 2020 was a really strong economy, in the sense that the Federal Reserve was not trying to raise rates to fight inflation. It was testing how low the unemployment rate could go. And the beneficiaries of that testing are people that are the last ones to get jobs. And so we saw that improvement. But then recession hits, and it takes longer for those people to come back, for those groups to get back to a better situation. And in the Great Recession, we stopped stimulus too soon, and the recovery was more drawn out than it needed to be. All of a sudden, in 2010, we had a new Congress, and in 2011, we were hearing about, the deficits, when we still needed stimulus to the economy.
Are gig workers counted in the rosters of unemployed? And I know that they do not receive unemployment insurance, so they're not counting there. Am I correct in that assumption? And so is this a true reflection of what's going on in our economy, given that perhaps about a third of workers are not counted? So
gig workers can be counted in the unemployment data. The unemployment data asks the survey that collects the unemployment data asks the question: are you working? If not, have you looked for work in the past 4 weeks? And if you answer yes, then you get counted as unemployed. And that has nothing to do with receiving unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance has different criteria, and you can receive unemployment insurance if you're part-time, if you're working fewer hours in some states. So there's not a direct connection between the unemployment numbers and the unemployment insurance numbers and the unemployment rate. Now, what the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, PUA, in the CARES Act did was provide unemployment insurance benefits, unemployment assistance benefits to gig workers and other people who did not have the qualifications to meet eligibility for UI in their state. And this latest legislation extended also the PUA program into March. So the CARES Act looks a lot more like what permanent unemployment insurance should look like, with more weeks of coverage that ideally trigger on when the unemployment rate goes up automatically without Congress having to act, that recognizes modern life in which people may have to take off time from work to take care of a sick child, and that should be something that allows you to receive unemployment insurance, and it doesn't in many states. You still can't get unemployment insurance if you quit voluntarily, but that's the nature of unemployment insurance. So the CARES Act was one of the unemployment insurance measures in the CARES Act were really quite strong, and it's too bad that $600 lapsed just at the time when it could have really boosted the recovery even more. And I'm glad at least something is back. And I would add something, Representative Lou, you talked about the mixed status stimulus checks. It's my understanding that it was even better than we first thought, because that extends back to the first stimulus payments as well, that people can apply for them from mixed status families and receive them as well. They had been excluded. And now they're not just included going forward, but they can get the ones that they were entitled to. So,
Chad Stone, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your insights.
I was happy to do it. Thank you.
Sandy, do you want to close with final remarks?
I feel it is a challenge to take on the coverage of what is so vital for all our audiences, to really understand what Congress has been able to do to address this worsening and disparate impact of the economic recession caused by the pandemic. Thank you, and thanks to all our speakers for giving us this very important panel on these crucial topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.